Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about something different. I'm going to talk about the concept of decriminalizing homosexuality in the Arab world. My interest in Islam is, constrained geographically to the Arab world. So, in August 1980, the Democratic Party of the United States included homosexual rights in its platform. 31 years later, in December of 2011, Barrack Obama issued a presidential memorandum directing all federal agencies engaged abroad, and I quote, to ensure that U.S. diplomacy and foreign assistance promote and protect the human rights of LGBT persons. The following day, Secretary General Hilary Clinton stood before the UN General Assembly in Geneva and gave a speech in which she asserted that LGBT rights were human rights. 6 months prior to this, in June of 2011, at the behest of South Africa, the United Nations Human Rights Council passed its very first resolution condemning violence and persecution on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, two successful resolutions have followed since. The most recent of these was voted on June 30th of this year, and it resulted in a mandate to appoint an independent expert to scrutinize specific contexts of persecution of sexual and gender minorities. In a parallel world, Russia, which is reverting to its Cold War counterpower by restoring its military prowess in the last 15 years, is also pitting itself rhetorically as an anti-imperial protector of endangered cultural rights. Vladimir Putin made this clear in his address to the annual presidential address to the Federal Assembly in Russia in December of 2013. And he asserted, and I quote, that Russia had no aspirations to be any sort of superpower with a claim to global or regional hegemony. We do not try to teach others how to live their lives. And of course, the implication is that the US does. The destruction of traditional values from above, Putin continued, is essentially anti-democratic since it is carried out on the basis of abstract, speculative ideas contrary to the will of the majority. Now, these comments should be seen in context of Russia's anti-gay and pedophilia propaganda law. That's the name of the law, and gay and pedophilia propaganda. And it's against that, and it was instituted in Russia earlier that year. There are, in fact, on a global level, as well as in Western academic theory, contemporary Western academic theory, two narratives that dominate about the internationalization of LGBT rights as human rights. In the first narrative, there's a claim for the existence of and the rights for gender and sexual minorities identified specifically as gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender. In the alternative narrative, this form of advocacy is seen as a Western imposition of Western concepts and values on others without consideration of cultural rights and variations, without consideration for religious beliefs or ethnic specificities. It is important to recognize that a critique of international LGBT rights as human rights is not necessarily always strategically homophobic in the way that Putin's work might be. So, for example, it is crucial for the health of the movement to be aware that key concepts required for having this conversation, such as individual freedom, privacy, sexual orientation, or gender identity, are currently epistemologically inaccessible, so they're difficult to comprehend. They do not have the epistemological scaffolding to be understood in many national contexts for us to have this conversation. Secondly, the use of labels to designate specific gender and sexual minorities like gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender fails to account for the diversity in gender and sexual practices across the globe, potentially alienating, misidentifying, or not identifying at all some groups or individuals that the movement purports to help. Thirdly, coercion of nation states to comply can have a deleterious counter effect. So in 2014, the US ceased aid to Uganda following a presidential anti-homosexuality bill. And this is a form of collective punishment, and it is not going to dissuade people from an already rampant popular belief and myth that homosexuals bring about national ruin. So we need to think about ways to, instead of coercion, to persuade more effectively. Now, having said all of this, it is also equally important to recognize that contemporary post-colonial theorists who keenly point out all the shortcomings that exist in the LGBT Rights International still fail spectacularly at being able to adequately address the depth and the breadth of state-sponsored persecution and prosecution of gender nonconformity and consensual adult same-sex practices and identities. So post-colonial theorists leave us with just a critique and a vacuum of being unable to do anything. So following the June 30th UN mandate to appoint an independent expert, Omar Ramadan, who is Egypt's permanent delegate in the UN, issued a letter to the UN Human Rights Council indicating that Egypt would boycott this mandate. He indicated that the mandate was in contradiction of the definition of the definition of universal rights as it is enshrined in international law. And he also said that it was very contentious. It had only been secured by a very small margin of votes, 17 to 19. And then he went on to add a personal note saying that he would desist from assisting the council in appointing an expert because to do so would go against, and I quote, the values that I stand for. In media interviews, Ramadan indicated that these resolutions, these types of resolutions, would be a precedent to the imposition of various civil liberties like marriage equality, gay adoption, and gay pride parades in the streets of Cairo and elsewhere in the world of traditional values. So he argued basically that the mandate's stated purpose, which is to protect people from violence and persecution, was only a cover, a Trojan horse for a backdoor usurping of traditional cultural values. And now he starts to sound a lot more like Vladimir Putin, who is coming to the rescue of these endangered cultural rights. The concern with the imposition of LGBT liberties masks a more fundamental, unspoken unwillingness to decriminalize homosexuality and to cease its state-sponsored persecution and prosecution, something in which Egypt, of all the 23 Arab countries in the world, is most heavily steeped and has been so since the turn of the century through large-scale police operations of surveillance, entrapment, incarceration, and torture. So it's really no surprise then that given this concern that they can no longer police sexual behavior, or the possibility that they may no longer police sexual behavior, Ramadan is joined by the Organization of Islamic Conference, which includes 57 member states and 5 observer states. And in his letter to the Council, dated July 29, Ramadan writes that all these nations except Albania shall boycott this mandate and shall not recognize its creation, nor cooperate or interact with it in any form or format. Less than 6 weeks prior to Mr. Ramadan's comment in June of this year, Egypt and a host of Muslim nations around the world issued official statements condemning the massacre of 49 people in attendance at a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida. Egypt was joined with similar reprisals by Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and many other nations across, Muslim nations across the world. But each of these nations that I have mentioned has at some point blocked a UN resolution or other to do with LGBT rights since the 1990s. The Secretary General of the Arab League, Mr. Nabil al-Arabi, issued a statement condemning the attack as a form of terrorism. And Al-Azhar, the world's leading Sunni institution of Islamic scholarship, decried it as un-Islamic. The statements recognize the humanity of the victims, but they also recognize their right to life, but they fail to recognize the connection between legalized persecution at the governmental level and the cultural violence resulting from reviling gender nonconformity and same-sex behavior or identities. The Orlando massacre is not dissimilar from killings that were carried out by both Sunni and Shia militias in Iraq following a US-led invasion which should be illegal under international law, to say the very least. In 2009, and again, I'm going to start with the Shia militias. In 2009 and again in 2012, gender non-conforming individuals as well as homosexual men were targeted through calculated killing sprees in the streets of Sadr city and Baghdad. The 2012 killings also targeted individuals who were unconventionally groomed or dressed. So people with long hair, men with long hair, were subject to these attacks as well. The killings in Baghdad and Sadr city have been attributed in part to the militias of the Mahdi army under the leadership of Ayatollah al-Sistani, who is said to have issued a decree on his website that those engaged in same-sex acts should be punished by death. There are several sources that indicate that this decree was retracted in 2006, so that would be 3 years prior to the first crime wave. As recently as July 7th of this year, Muqtada Sadr, who is the leader of the Sadr militia, to whom these killings have also been in part attributed, responded to a question, a letter from a follower saying, what do we do with people who are engaged in suspicious relationships and men who act and dress like women? So again, that concept of gay, it doesn't quite fit very well in these contexts. And so his response to that was that these people were mentally ill and that although scripture forbids their doings, they should not be harmed. They should be ostracized, because if they are to be harmed, and this is his logic, then this would act as a further deterrent for them to respond to reasonable means to treat them and bring them along kind of the straight path. In recent years, the self-proclaimed Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, so now I'm talking about the Sunni murders, has televised carrying out punishments for crimes in accordance with its Sharia. So these are a variety of crimes, and among these is the crime of liwat or male sodomy. And they've televised throwing men from rooftops and following them with stoning on a number of occasions. It's been broadcast across social media. The most recent example took place a day after the UN Security Council condemned the Orlando massacre. So it was not very long ago. The actions of the Shia militias seem to harbor cognitive dissonance on the subject, with the official ruling contradicting the mass murders. As ISIS's Wahhabi Sharia, on the other hand, is in consort with their actions, where homosexual conduct is indeed punishable by death. Now, even this very notion is not beyond dispute. A famous Saudi scholar named Salman al-Auda, who, to be fair, is a contentious figure, having been imprisoned by the regime in the 1990s and only recently reformed, put forward an argument quite publicly, internationally, that to kill homosexuals is worse than homosexuality itself. And what al-Auda is doing is he's pointing to a historical argument and it's actually an open secret among scholars of Islam, both Sunni and Shia. They know it and they conveniently ignore it. And that is that there are no verses in the Quran that prescribe judicial or worldly punishment of any kind for homosexual behavior, let alone for gender nonconformity. So this might actually seem like a really small point, but it is absolutely crucial where the effort to decriminalize is taking place in nation states where the law is based on religion. And there are many instances where the law is secular and it's not based on religion, but where it is based on the religion is where it is most austere and where this point is absolutely essential to bring up. The Wahhabi school of thought currently dominates politically and is spreading culturally in the Arab world. But it is counterbalanced by the other Sunni authoritative body, and that is Al-Azhar, which is the University of Al-Azhar is based in Egypt, but it also trains scholars from all around the world. The Egyptian penal code, by the way, is secular, so that's why Al-Azhar doesn't have a direct hand in influencing the penal code. But on that point, it's worth noting what Al-Azhar seems to think. Sheikh Al-Azhar, so they say the chief of Al-Azhar, basically asserted that the Orlando massacre was un-Islamic, and that although, it's Quranically unacceptable for people to engage in homosexual behavior, it is unacceptable to bring harm to these persons. And the Mufti of Egypt, Shawqi Alam, also asserted things along a similar line. And both he, Shawqi Alam, Ahmad al-Khatib, Sheikh al-Azhar, and Muqtada Sadr, who is a Shia leader, have all stated at some stage or another that their personal opinion is that homosexuality is an illness. So now we're moving away from criminalization towards pathologization. But it's very important to recognize that this is a personal opinion that is not supported by scripture in any way. They have in terms of creating laws based on religion, the idea that homosexuality is an illness is an opinion that's not supported scripturally. Many Muslim majority countries prosecute gender nonconformity and homosexuality, as I said earlier, under secular laws. But Al-Azhar is important in the sense that it influences people culturally and it influences the Muslim international. It's not confined to Egypt and other countries. I think I'm running out of time. So I'm going to close with suggesting that what we really need to do is pay attention to the internal logic of each national context when we're working on decriminalizing homosexuality, and to work with the internal logic of the culture, the law, the constitution of that specific state, not to make any general statements. Of course, I can't do that in the 15 minutes that I have, but really slow, organic social change that is in keeping with that internal logic is going to be the most sustainable and the most meaningful and the most peaceful form of social change that we can hope for. Thank you.